CNN political analyst and Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin. He is the author of Chaos Under Heaven and has extensively covered the investigations into the origin of coronavirus. And to be clear about what Josh is reporting has suggested, it's that the lab leak theory was dismissed too early and too definitively without compelling evidence. Right, Josh? So when you hear Professor Gary talk about the evidence he's looking at, what's your takeaway?
Right, John. Well, it's very clear that Professor Gary and a bunch of scientists who agree with him have been of the opinion that the natural origin theory is more likely ever since the pandemic emerged last year. This is the position that Professor Gary and his friends established for themselves a year ago. Their position hasn't changed. I didn't hear anything new, actually, in what Professor Gary said or in what they wrote that would add to the strength of their position. And there's another group of scientists out there, including Robert Redfield, the former head of the CDC, and David Baltimore, the former president of Caltech, who have the exact opposite opinion. In other words, there's no scientific consensus. You can look at the data, you can look at the virus, and virologists come to the completely opposite conclusions, which is why, I think a lot of people like me have always argued that we just need to investigate both theories, investigate the natural origin theory and the lab leak theory. Of course, we can't do that because the Chinese government won't allow us to investigate the lab leak theory. I do think it's important to mention a couple of things that I thought that Professor Gary said that were a little misleading. The first cases reported in China were not actually linked to any of the markets, according to the Chinese government's own research at the time. The Chinese CDC actually disavowed the market theory in May 2020, and there are no actual links to the wildlife trade. There are suggested links. In other words, there are animals in the markets that could have been a link, but there's never been any animal found that had any real link. So I just think that sort of the presentation that Robert Gary just gave us was a little misleading in that regard. But again, he's of the opinion that it had to come from the market, which is right next to the lab, by the way. I don't know why you said that they're far apart. They're really close to each other. A lot of other people feel a different way. We just need to get to the bottom of it one way or the other.
The big problem is that there's no way to get to the bottom of it, right? One thing, because China cleaned out the markets, so you can't deeply investigate that theory. On the other hand, they're not giving us results from people who worked at the Wuhan lab, so there's just a big block in either direction here.
Well, I think there's a lot more that we can find out. First of all, on the U.S. side, the intelligence that you asked Robert Gary about, there's a lot more of that the Biden administration could and should release. What we've heard is that those sick researchers did not have the flu. By the way, the Chinese denied that there were any sick researchers. But what U.S. intelligence believes is that they had COVID-like symptoms and they were working on coronaviruses in the secret part of the lab, the part that they didn't tell us about, the part that they didn't tell Robert Gary about, right? So there's a lot of U.S. intelligence that should come to light. I think that's what Congress is focused on. And then there has to be more pressure on the Chinese government to play ball and to allow access to the labs, to put back up the virus database that they took offline. It was supposed to be a public database, to make the scientists available, to make the data available. It's an urgent issue of national security and public health. So we can't just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, I guess the Chinese government's not going to cooperate. We have to use the tools of our national power and influence to pressure them to cooperate because, again, it's an urgent public health issue that's affecting us to this day.
Josh, hang on one second, because I guess Professor Gary stuck around and has been listening to this. And Professor, you wanted to respond.
Well, sure. I mean, actually, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the place where they do all the live virus culture and the isolation of coronaviruses, is about 20 miles away from the large seafood market. So that is a fact that you have to put on the table there. In terms of the three researchers, I don't know if those people exist or not. I do hope that, we have firm intelligence on that. I agree with it. We need to get that, piece of information either proven or disproven one way or the other.
Yeah, I would just say the Wuhan CDC is literally about 1,000 meters from the one market. The point is that to say that it started from the market should be backed by evidence. And the first earliest cases that we know of had no connection to the market. That's what's clear. So the market theory is really not supported by any evidence. And as for the U.S. intelligence...
Hang on, Josh. Let me ask the professor to respond to that.
Well, actually, there is a lot of evidence. There's epidemiological evidence. There's the genetic evidence that we have that, there was no way that anybody could have put this virus together, cobbled together in the lab from bits and pieces from other viruses. And that's pretty strong scientific evidence that this virus, wasn't built at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah, I just need to say that, top virologists totally disagree about that. And not being a virologist, I'll leave that to the virologists to debate. But the bottom line here is that, if you're going to be suspect of U.S. intelligence and confident in the Chinese government statements, well, then you're going to come out with one conclusion. And if you're going to be suspect of the Chinese government statements and confident in U.S. intelligence, then you're going to come out with a different conclusion. I think it's very, very clear that the Chinese government is engaged in a massive cover-up focused on the lab. That's why they won't let us into the lab. They're thwarting the lab investigation. And I would ask Dr. Gary, why not investigate the lab? Shouldn't we investigate the lab? Even if you think it's unlikely, that's really the only way to settle this. And why even come to a conclusion when we can just honestly state between all of us that we don't know. You don't know, I don't know, John Berman, you don't know.
I certainly don't know.
And so we have to figure it out. And so it's not really helpful to say, oh, the lab theory is very unlikely, because you don't know that.
Professor?
We have to have an actual forensic investigation, not a scientific investigation. And by the way, they don't have to have manipulated the virus in order for the lab to be involved. They could have captured the virus, got it into the lab. Again, the bats and the pangolins weren't in the market. They were in Yunnan. The bats were 1,000 miles away. So they could have brought a natural virus to the lab, and then it could have leaked, or they could have done. There are a lot of options here.
Let's let the professor respond to that. Yeah. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, I mean, it is hard to respond to all of that, but there really is no evidence that the virus leaked from the lab. There's just many more opportunities for the virus to have spilled over from nature, just like it occurred in the first outbreak of SARS, almost 20 years ago now. So yeah, let's look at all the things. Let's put some of this information that's out there that, is coming from some questionable sources and put that to rest. And I do agree that the Chinese have not been as transparent as they should be about, the early cases, the early epidemiology of the outbreak. In particular, they haven't been transparent about the wildlife trade and about all the animals that were being sold at this market. So we do need to, have some diplomacy work with the Chinese government, try to figure out what went on there exactly so that we don't have another pandemic like we've all been through and that we're still going through. It's not over yet.
All right, Professor Gary, I want to thank you for your time, and thanks for sticking around. I'm going to change subjects here with Josh, because you also wrote over the last day about something I think a lot of people didn't see happen yesterday, which is that the Biden administration met with the brother of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, his brother Khalid, who a lot of people also connect to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. This is a picture of him meeting with different State Department, the first picture was a picture of him meeting with different State Department officials here in the United States. Why did the U.S. take this meeting? Why is the U.S. meeting with someone who some people connect to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi? What does it tell you?
It's a great question. The Biden administration is trying to have its cake and eat it too. They want to say that they're being tough on Saudi Arabia for its atrocious and worsening human rights record. At the same time, they want to do business with Saudi Arabia on the areas of mutual interest, and I get that. But the way that they decided to do that was by welcoming back the former ambassador, Khalid bin Salman, the brother of Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who the CIA asserts was responsible for the murder and dismemberment of Washington Post contributing columnist Jamal Khashoggi. And the allegation by the U.S. intelligence services is that his brother Khalid lured him into the Istanbul consulate, where he was later murdered, although we can't prove that he knew that he was going to get murdered, but at least he told him that it was going to be safe. So it seems like a weird thing to invite the guy who was connected to the murder back to have a bunch of pictures and give him the red carpet treatment and let him meet with the defense secretary and the national security advisor. It sends the signal to the Saudis and to the region and to the human rights community, frankly, that the Biden administration's protestations against Saudi atrocities are just that, just words and not actions. And it signals a return to business as usual. And that spells disaster for people who believe in pressing the Saudi regime to improve on its human rights records. And it also, in my opinion, insults the legacy of Jamal Khashoggi and reneges on Biden's promise to deliver justice to Jamal and his family.
Josh Rogin, bringing it this morning on several continents, too. Thank you very much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.